Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, and get updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get updates to the forecast through that means. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look. We have quite a few warnings and advisories out, much of them along the west coast of the state or southern portions of the interior to include the Alaska range. Now the ones out west we're going to start out with, those are largely in effect now going into Wednesday afternoon time frame for a lot of the more southern locations. Along the coastline we're seeing areas of snow and blowing snow, especially as we get into the Seward Peninsula and areas further to the north. A lot of those are going to last into early on Thursday as we get further to the north, and gradually as we get up to the Arctic coastline, lasting into late on Thursday. Now it's just blowing snow conditions up along the Arctic coastline, but if you are traveling, please be mindful that it will be difficult to get through those areas, and there will be some blowing snow reducing visibilities. It's also going to be true along the west coast. The winter storm warnings that we have out for snow and blowing snow, heaviest amounts of snow are expected to be on the southern side of the Seward Peninsula, and blowing snow conditions as we get north of the Norton Sound. Down in the areas around the Yukon Delta, we are going to see some coastal flooding happening. This is going to be in the 3 to 5 foot range above the normal high tide line, and that's going to be true for the Yukon Delta coast as well as the southern side of the Seward Peninsula, including Nome. As we move further inland, we are going to see some winter weather advisories. These are for snow and blowing snow, but there is a chance that some of that snow could get mixed with rain or freezing rain in those locations with the influx of warmer air that we do have over the area. These are going to expire later and later as we move through on Wednesday and then into Thursday as we move further to the east, as this system is expected to track to the east. Eventually that snow is going to make it into eastern locations of the interior as well on Wednesday and Thursday. For the Alaska range and areas around the Alaska range, we have high wind warnings out and then high wind watches for the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula. We'll take a look at those a little bit more in depth in these next couple of slides. Starting in the Alaska range, you can see the image on the right is showing the actual peak wind gusts. We are going to see wind gusts getting up to around 80 miles per hour. The highest of that going to be in the eastern portion of the Brooks Range. It is important to note that we are going to have gusty winds through the passes. That does include both the Parks Highway and the Richardson Highway in areas moving through the Alaska Range and areas to the north such as Delta Junction. In other locations, Upper Kuskokwim Valley, the strongest gusts are going to be around 70 miles per hour, 75 for areas around Denali, and then Deltana and Tanana Flats area to about 70 miles per hour. All these are going to go into Wednesday, with the latest one being the eastern Alaska Range to 6 p.m. on Wednesday. For the Anchorage area and down the Turnagain Arm area, we are going to see some stronger winds. For Turnagain Arm specifically, these are going to have gusts up to 80 miles per hour. This is Wednesday into Thursday. Again, this is along Turnagain Arm. We do not expect these stronger winds to make it into the main part of Anchorage. They should stay out by Turnagain Arm. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we have a low pressure system moving to the northern Bering that you can see the front draped across the west coast of the state. Down around the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, we can see a new low developing on that old system. A weaker low is following behind this one in the Bering Sea. And then finally, we'll look at a low in the eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing some precipitation to the Panhandle. As we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we can see some of those showers behind that frontal system, but out ahead of this, some warmer air coming in with the southerly flow. Snow out ahead of that with blowing snow conditions up by the Seward Peninsula, extending up to the northwest coast with heavier snow for areas from the Seward Peninsula and further into the western interior. South of that, we're going to see a mixture of rain and snow at many locations with some rain by the water and a mix of rain and snow showers along the Aleutians. High pressure out ahead of this, going to keep South Central dry, and then some areas of mixed rain and snow for the Panhandle. As we move into tonight, clearing out for much of the Panhandle, but our system is extending more snow further to the central portions of mainland Alaska, including South Central Alaska. Still a chance of some freezing precipitation with some of the warmer air coming in for those southwestern portions of the interior, blowing snow and snow conditions up from the Seward Peninsula up to the northwest coast. Now it's starting to spread along the Arctic coastline for snow that's already on the ground. Behind this system, we're going to see some snow showers throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians with a mixture of rain and snow as we move towards the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutian Islands. As we move into Wednesday, some of the winds starting to die down as that frontal system starts to break down and move with the main new low out in the Gulf of Alaska, but still enough wind along the Arctic coastline to see blowing snow. Snow throughout much of mainland Alaska now, including all of the southwest and south central areas, as well as much of the interior. We're going to see a mixture of rain and snow in central and northern places of the Panhandle, with snow up to the northern locations of Lynn Canal to include Haines and Skagway. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we're going to see westerly winds bringing snow showers to the area with a mixture of rain and snow for the Alaska Peninsula. As we move into Thursday, still seeing snow out over the Bering Sea with a new system coming in, bringing a mix of rain and snow back to the central and western Aleutian Islands. Lighter snow for much of mainland Alaska, but still consistently snowing up along the Arctic coastline and much of the interior. Then some snow along the North Gulf Coast as well, and then a mixture of rain and snow for much of the Panhandle. So look at our low temperatures into the 20s for much of the Panhandle area, below zero for eastern portions of the interior, in single digits along the coastline, near freezing for much of southwest Alaska, and then in the 30s for the Aleutian Islands. As we move into Wednesday afternoon, highs getting up near 40 for the Aleutians, into the mid-30s for southwest. Colder as we move into the interior, staying down in single digits for those highs in the northeastern portions, including the Yukon Flats area, near 40 for much of the Panhandle, and into the 30s for south central. On Thursday morning, dropping down into the 30s for the Panhandle, into the 20s for south central. Single digits to near zero for the eastern interior, and then near the 20s along the west coast, and the 30s for the Aleutians. Thursday afternoon highs getting up to near 40 degrees for the Aleutians, 30s along the west coast, and then continuing to get colder as we move further to the east into the teens for the eastern locations of the interior and Arctic coastline, 30 near south central.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll take a look at our flying weather on Wednesday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, behind our frontal system, we have some MVFR conditions out over the area. For our frontal system moving into the west coast of the state, we are going to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions. It's going to extend down the west coast through Kodiak Island and starting to make its way into the eastern portions of the Kenai Peninsula. The rest of the north slope, much of the interior, and much of south central Alaska should be VFR throughout Wednesday morning, and then the majority of the Panhandle should also be VFR, with the exception of some areas along the coastal mountains where we will see some MVFR conditions. As we move into Wednesday afternoon, southern portions of the Panhandle will clear up and become VFR, but our front pushing through the Gulf of Alaska is going to bring some MVFR conditions to northern locations of the Panhandle. That front is also going to bring some IFR and MVFR conditions to south central Alaska and western portions of the interior and up through the Kotzebue Sound area. Eastern interior and north slope should be VFR throughout Wednesday afternoon, and then out over the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and making its way into the southwest coastline, MVFR conditions are expected. Thursday morning, we'll see an area of IFR conditions extending from the northwest coastline through the interior portions of the state down into south central Alaska and to the northern portions of the Panhandle. Also going to see some IFR conditions in the southern portions of the Panhandle with MVFR conditions in between. Some MVFR conditions also down much of the west coast of the state, down through Kodiak Island and out through the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. As we move into Thursday afternoon, we're going to see more MVFR conditions throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians, with IFR conditions coming in from the south towards the central and western Aleutian Islands. Out over mainland Alaska, most locations will see MVFR conditions, with some areas of IFR through the interior, Brooks Range, and northwest coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, primarily MVFR conditions, but areas up in the northern locations going to see IFR, and then down in the southeastern locations, IFR conditions expected as well. Through the passes starting up north, AKwx should be VFR throughout the day on Wednesday. Adigan Pass also expected to be VFR. Lake Clark should be IFR throughout the day on Wednesday. However, Merrill will start off MVFR and then drop down to IFR in the afternoon. Rainy Pass will also start off MVFR, dropping down to IFR conditions. And Windy will start off VFR and then drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Isabel Pass also going to start VFR, dropping down to marginal conditions. And Mentasta should be VFR throughout the day Wednesday. Tanita will start off VFR, dropping down to MVFR. And Portage should be down in IFR conditions throughout the day Wednesday. There's a chance in the early morning hours to start off with some MVFR, but primarily throughout the day, IFR conditions are expected. For Chilkoot and White, going to start off VFR and then drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. For our freezing levels, one area of warmer air over the western portions of the interior. Our surface freezing line, however, is going to move through the Bering Sea, down through southwest Alaska, and then along the north Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle. an area of warmer air extending up into the Gulf of Alaska, with freezing heights 4,000 feet just to the south of the coastline. For our icing, expecting to see some icing with our frontal system through the west coast down into the Gulf of Alaska, below 10,000 feet up near the Kotzebue Sound area, between 3,000 and 10,000 feet as we move over southwest Alaska, and then above 5,000 feet as we get out over the Gulf waters. Out over the Aleutian Islands, we're going to see freezing or icing levels above 1,000 feet. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is just to the south of the Aleutian Islands, getting up to as high as 115 knots out of a northwesterly direction. Out over the islands, going to be down more around 80 knots. Over the southwestern portion of the state, southerly winds up to as high as 110 knots are expected. Then moving over our ridge out over northwestern Canada at 110 knots as well out of a northwesterly direction. As we move down to 9,000 feet, we're going to see westerly flow throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Strongest winds are going to be around 50 to 55 knots near the Pribilof Islands as well as by the western Aleutians. Out over the west coast, some of our strongest winds are going to be out by the Kotzebue Sound area, up to as high as 70 knots out of a southeasterly direction. And then the strongest area of winds is going to be over the Kenai Peninsula out of a southerly direction at 80 knots. Then down over the Panhandle area, we're going to see northwesterly winds around 40 knots, increasing with speed as we move off to the south of the Panhandle. At 3,000 feet, continued westerly flow out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, 40 to 45 knots expected. Strongest winds for the Kotzebue Sound area are going to be 65 knots out of a southeasterly direction, diminishing but staying around 40 down to southwest Alaska. And then out near the south central area, we're going to see some winds up to as high as 55 knots out of a southeasterly direction near Prince William Sound, with stronger winds further to the south in the Gulf. For turbulence, much of the state is going to see turbulence with this strong system moving through below 3,000 feet by the western Aleutians, below 4,000 feet for much of the west coast and Alaska Peninsula, below 6,000 feet for the northern Gulf Coast, and below 5,000 feet for the Panhandle.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Cable, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty. You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise. even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both AKwx and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a look at the ice edge. Beaufort Sea is now pretty much 100% ice covered, and we have ice extending all along the west coast of the state with some very light ice concentrations down as far south as Bristol Bay. Some more ice is in the Kotzebue Sound area and Norton Sound area, and we're seeing some ice in the northern part of Cook Inlet as well. Taking a look now at the marine forecast for southeast Alaska and the inside waters, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots for the most part. However, in the central areas, we are seeing some gusts up to as high as 40 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, south to southeast winds 25 knots out east, getting up to as high as 35 to 45 knots up in the north. As we move into Thursday, out over the Gulf waters, east to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest further to the north, with seas up to as high as 16 feet. In the inside waters, northerly winds 20 knots for most locations. However, in southeast areas, we are going to see southeasterly winds 20 knots. For south central Alaska, out over the Gulf waters, up to as high as 55 knots as we get closer towards the Prince William Sound area, with 50 knots in Prince William Sound out of that southeasterly direction. Seas up to as high as 17 feet out over the Gulf and to the west of the Barren Islands. In the Cook Inlet area, east to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots, stronger farther to the south, and then 45 knots out of a southeast direction west of the Barren Islands. On Thursday, in the Cook Inlet area, west to southwest winds 15 knots, southerly winds 25 knots west of the Barren Islands, 30 knots out of a southwesterly direction east of the Barren Islands, and then 25 knots for the rest of the Gulf, switching over to southeasterly winds as we get in the far northern locations with barrier jet over in the area. Out over Prince William Sound, northwesterly winds 15 knots expected. For Wednesday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, around Kodiak Island, southwesterly winds 30 to 35 knots, and then westerly winds 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Seas highest on the Pacific side up to as high as 23 feet. On Thursday, still a primarily westerly direction, a little bit more south as we move into Thursday. 20 to 25 knots on the Bering side, 25 to 30 knots on the Pacific side, and 20 to 25 knots around Kodiak Island. So look at the Aleutian Islands on Wednesday, westerly winds throughout the area, 25 to 30 knots out east, getting up to 35 knots for the central Aleutians, and then up to as high as 40 knots by the western Aleutians, with seas up to as high as 22 feet, highest farther to the west. On Thursday, we're going to see southerly winds out by the western Aleutians 30 to 40 knots, getting stronger as we move to the east. Central Aleutian, southwest winds 30 to 35 knots, and then 30 knots out of a westerly direction by the eastern Aleutian Islands. Seas highest on the Pacific side up to as high as 19 feet. For the west coast on Wednesday, west to southwest winds in all locations, 20 knots by St. Lawrence Island, 35 knots in Norton Sound, 25 to 30 knots around Nunavik Island, and 30 knots by both St. Matthew Island and the Pribilof Islands. Then on Thursday, still somewhat of a south to southwest direction, 30 knots by the Pribilof Islands, 25 knots by St. Matthew, 20 to 25 knots up the west coast till Norton Sound, where we'll see southeast winds 15 knots and southerly winds 20 knots by St. Lawrence Island. For the Arctic coastline on Wednesday, easterly winds at 30 to 35 knots, picking up as we move down the northwestern coastline, 40 to 45 knots there, 45 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound, and then as we get south of the Bering Strait, southwesterly winds, 20 knots expected. On Thursday, along the Arctic coastline, east to northeast winds, 25 to 30 knots, 20 to 30 knots out of an easterly direction for the northwest coast, then down by the strait, southerly winds, 15 to 20 knots. Quick recap of our weather. We do have a strong system moving through the west coast that is bringing quite a bit of snow and blowing snow conditions up the west coast, especially as we get north of the Norton Sound area and western locations of the interior. This is going to spread further to the east, extending some advisories out further to the east as well. We do have some winter storm warnings along the west coast for that snow and blowing snow. We also see elevated surf moving into Thursday area for some of the Seward Peninsula areas. It's going to be 3 to 5 feet above normal high tide for the Yukon Delta coast and the north side of the Norton Sound as well. We're going to also see some snow showers out for the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, a mix of rain and snow for the eastern Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula, and snow starting to push further into south central Alaska. Strong winds expected through the Turnagain Arm area as well as through the Alaska Range, especially as we move into tomorrow. Then out over the Panhandle area, we expect some clearing with high pressure, but as we move into Wednesday, start to see some precipitation come back to the northern locations. Snow continuing to spread throughout mainland Alaska as well as south central Alaska for Wednesday. We're still going to see blowing snow conditions up along the Arctic coastline, extending from areas from Kaktovik all the way out through the Point Hope area. Then we're going to see some snow out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands as well. Finally, on Thursday, more snow from much of the mainland as well as the Bering Sea, with a new system approaching the Aleutian Islands, bringing up some more warm air.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.